Once again, my wife, I love her very much, and there's simply no way she could have done any violence to Ron or Kathy in any way. Michelle Nothick, at first glance, is an ordinary woman. But within the walls of this house, she turned her friends into slaves, kept them for years, and then made them disappear. What happened behind the closed doors of the Music Nothick family could easily have been the script for a horror film. Except this story is real. This episode is about a mother of 3 children who, behind the facade of a good Samaritan, was hiding a real house of horrors. It all took place in the small town of Raymond, Washington State, in the 1990s and early 2000s. Michelle Shelley Nothick appeared to be an exemplary mother and a reliable friend. Together with her husband David, she raised 3 daughters and helped friends and relatives during difficult periods of their lives. She even invited some to come live with her. Only the guests of this small house started disappearing without a trace. Later, the world would learn that people unlucky enough to accept Michelle's help found themselves in a trap. Torture, humiliation, and complete submission to their new mistress awaited them. How did it happen that a woman considered an exemplary mother became known as Monster Mom, and her home is now called the House of Horrors? Let's start from the very beginning. Michelle Nothick was born in 1954 into a troubled family. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, and they lived with their mentally ill mother, Sharon. Sharon suffered from alcoholism and moonlighted as a sex worker. She eventually abandoned the children. Michelle was only 6 at the time. The children were left to live with their father, Les Watson, and his new wife, Laura Stallings. The stepmother and father tried to give her a normal life, but Michelle showed cruelty and a tendency toward manipulation from an early age. Instead of caring for her younger siblings, she tormented them. She would, for example, put broken glass in their shoes. She found this amusing. When Shelley was 13, her biological mother, Sharon, died. At that point, her biological mother and her new husband had become homeless. It is known that the cause of death was a beating. Michelle wasn't particularly bothered. She wasn't interested in how her biological mother was doing at all. But she hated her stepmother, Laura, and constantly said so. Shelley never once asked about her mother. Instead, she constantly tormented her siblings. She would blame them for undone homework, then deliberately start fights. This was only made worse by the fact that her brother, Paul, had behavioral problems and didn't get along with people at all. And her other brother never stood up for himself. Shelley always did everything for him. It was something beyond childhood arguments. She would break glass into tiny pieces and put it into her brother's shoes. Now tell me, what normal person does something like that? In March 1969, Shelley was 14, and that was when she first showed what she was truly capable of. The girl simply didn't come home from school. In a panic, Laura and Les started calling teachers, thinking something terrible had happened. And indeed it had. At school, they were told that Shelley was in a juvenile detention center. The twist is that she ended up there not as an offender, but as a complainant. Michelle accused her own father of rape, a lie intended to attract attention. A medical examination disproved that anyone had assaulted the girl or that there had been any sexual contact at all. Later, stepmother Laura found a battered copy of Drew Confessions magazine in her room with a bold headline on the cover, "I was raped by my father at age 15. It isn't hard to see where she got her idea for slander against her dad. After this incident, the girl was sent to several sessions with a psychologist, individually and with the family. Shelley refused to admit anything other than her own innocence. Eventually, she was sent to live with her stepmother's parents. They hoped that in a new environment, she would calm down. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Her tantrums continued. It is known that she offered to babysit neighbors' children and then locked them in rooms by barricading the doors with heavy furniture. Want a twist? She accused her adoptive grandfather of molestation. Falsely, of course. Shelley's youth passed in manipulations, scandals, and early marriages. By 1987, she had already been married twice and given birth to 2 daughters, Nikki and Sammy. Both girls were from different men but remained living with their mother. In 1987, Michelle met her 3rd husband, David Nothick, a former military man, a Navy veteran, and a contractor by trade. Nikki was 12 at the time, and Sammy was 9. David treated his stepdaughters like his own daughters from the very beginning. He worked to make sure they had everything they wanted. And 2 years later, in '89, the couple had a daughter together. Tori Notek. At first glance, the Nothic family was typical for their time. David worked hard in construction to provide the girls with a good life. Michelle was a homemaker. They lived in the small, quiet town of Raymond, Washington State. Michelle played the role of a relaxed mom, making sure her daughters were dressed in the best clothes and looked popular at school. She created a kind of illusion of normalcy. Behind the walls of that house, though, everything was far from what it seemed from the outside. According to her daughters, Shelley was a master manipulator who took pleasure in harming and humiliating others. Shelley humiliated her older daughters, Nikki and Sammy. For example, she forced them to give her tufts of pubic hair. This had no purpose other than one: to psychologically break the girls and demonstrate her power over them. This act of humiliation was a form of psychological abuse. Among the punishments was locking the girls in a dog cage. Over time, the reasons for punishment became more and more trivial, and sometimes there was no reason at all. Shelley could explode due to her own fits of rage. Sammy even started wearing pants and long-sleeve tops to hide bruises at school. Nikki suffered no less. Once she shoved Nikki's head through a glass door, screaming, "Look what you've made me do!" The girl sustained injuries and was bleeding. But Mama wasn't in a hurry to take her to the hospital. She then removed the glass from the daughter's skin herself, bandaged the wounds, hugged her as if feeling sorry, while simultaneously blaming her, saying things like, "Look what you made me do." So the blame was Nikki's all along. David Nothic later confirmed this, recalling how his wife, during one of her rage attacks, would hit him in the face, knowing he would remain submissive. The only one Shelley didn't touch at that time was her youngest daughter, Tori. But eventually that changed too. Michelle offered help to everyone who had nowhere to go. Like, "Come to us, you can stay while you get back on your feet." That's roughly how she lured her victims. Though back then, no one would have used words like victim or lured. To everyone, she was a good friend. 1988. The first victim of this house was her 13-year-old nephew, Shane Watson. Shane's father was a member of a biker gang and was in prison, and his mother lived in poverty and couldn't take care of herself, let alone him. Michelle rushed to help and offered Shane a place to stay for a while. The moment he moved in, Michelle established her rules. And of course, punishments. One of the punishments was called wallowing. It literally translates as rolling, though it had nothing to do with that. It was a punishment Michelle applied for things as minor as going to the bathroom without permission. The punishment involved ordering the boy and her daughters as well to stand completely naked in the cold while she doused them with cold water. And believe me, that was far from the worst of it. Once she forced Shane and her daughter Nikki to undress and ordered them to dance while she watched, laughing hysterically. Shane Watson would be trapped in this house for many long years, but he wasn't the only one. 30-year-old Kathy Loreno worked as a hairdresser. In '88, or by other accounts, in the early '90s, Kathy had a falling out with her family and lost her job. Michelle, hearing about this, immediately rushed to save her friend. Something like, "Come to us, you'll help with the kids, and we'll help with housing." So Kathy Loreno ended up in the Nothic house, agreeing to look after the children in exchange for a roof over her head and food. At first, Kathy considered Michelle her close friend. She came happily, grateful as best she could be. She did housework and looked after the children. But very quickly, her life turned into a nightmare. From that point on, 2 victims lived in the House of Horrors instead of 1. Music. Michelle started controlling Kathy's every step. Any small thing could trigger a fit of rage. At first, it was screaming and insults, then increasingly perverted punishments. Michelle seemed to take pleasure in inventing new ways to humiliate her friend. Kathy endured it. She had nowhere to go. She had become a slave in her friend's home, performing all the housework and looking after the children, all under the constant fear of new abuse. Michelle gradually isolated Kathy from the outside world, forbidding contact with family, intercepting letters, refusing to let her use the phone, and occasionally forcing her to take strong sedatives to keep her victim zombified and weak. Eventually, Kathy simply vanished from other people's lives. Physically, she was locked inside the Nothic house. Kathy had been transformed into a slave. I asked her what had happened. I just wanted to understand. Because a few days earlier, I had noticed that Kathy's eyes didn't look quite right. I asked if she had fallen, or maybe taken something, maybe ingested or swallowed something. She was forced to sleep on a concrete floor in the basement near the boiler, like she hadn't earned a normal bed. She was fed poorly. Food was often taken away entirely as punishment. Later, Michelle's daughters would testify that one day when they came home from school, they saw Kathy standing completely naked and wet outside behind the house, trembling from the cold. The girls even remembered their mother forcing them to jab Kathy with scissors. Horrific! After several years of torture, she had lost nearly half her body weight. Her teeth had fallen out. Her body was covered in wounds and bruises. Kathy Loreno, like Shane Watson, would be trapped in that small house. Over the next 5 years, she endured the most varied tortures orchestrated by Shelley Nottek, with David's silent complicity. Shane Watson, who had been trapped in the house since the age of 13, could no longer bear to watch. He no longer wanted to stay silent and decided to challenge this monster. Shane began gathering evidence. He stole a camera and secretly photographed Kathy. Exhausted, unclothed, lying on the floor, he planned to escape and hand over those images to the police. We'll get to that in a moment. And here you can see a QR code. Please donate. Not much is left now. And for any donation, you can win a vinyl record player. Details below the video. Through her actions, Michelle Nottek drove Kathy to death. She essentially killed her. According to the New York Post, among all the tortures, there was waterboarding, a form of torture that simulates drowning. You may have seen it in films. The face and airways are covered with a cloth or towel, and water is poured over the top. This causes the person to suffocate. Water enters the lungs, panic sets in, the sensation of drowning overwhelms. In addition, beatings, psychological abuse, pouring bleach music into open wounds. After 5 years of captivity, Kathy Loreno slowly died at the age of 36 in the basement of that house, most likely from the numerous beatings and abuse. That day, I think, she said, she wasn't feeling very well, so she spent most of the day lying down. What did she look like the last time you saw her? Was she just lying on her back and breathing? Breathing normally? Normally, but a bit heavy. And as I said, after that, I didn't know what to do. So I went in again, a third or fourth time, to check on her and noticed she had stopped breathing. Then I went up to Kathy, patriarch, called her name and asked if she was all right, but she didn't answer. At that moment, David realized what his tolerance of his wife's cruelty had led to, and he was even going to call the police. But Michelle wouldn't allow it and intimidated him. Michelle decided to cover her tracks. On her orders, David carried Kathy's dead body outside, and that same night they burned it in a large barrel in the yard. The remains and ashes were poured into bags and scattered along the ocean coast. That is how Kathy Loreno disappeared forever. Her relatives would occasionally call and ask Michelle how Kathy was doing, to which she replied, "Oh, everything's fine. Kathy met someone and is doing great with him. Some trucker named Rocky. They headed off to California." Some people, of course, didn't believe her, but Michelle masked her crimes. In such cases, she would show forged letters supposedly written by Kathy on the road. The investigation would later determine that no Rocky ever existed and that all the letters had been written by Michelle herself. Kathy's brother didn't believe it and hired a private detective. The detective concluded that Kathy had likely been murdered. As they say, no body, no case. Without evidence, the police couldn't do anything at the time. Kathy Loreno's case remained open for years as a missing person case, while Michelle remained unpunished. Inside the house where it all happened, the children continued to live. And yet another victim, one nobody knew about. Let's pause for a moment and look at what was really going on inside the Nottek household. Because Michelle terrorized not only Kathy. Under her control were everyone who lived with her, her husband, her nephew, and even her own daughters. This is important for understanding why no one dared to escape or go to the police. Michelle was a manipulator at the highest level. She established a regime of total fear in the house. In the morning, everything might be quiet, even cheerful. Mom is just being mom. She'll hug you, say she loves you. Then an hour later, something trivial happens, and that same mom is raging like a madwoman. The eldest daughter, Nikki, recalls, "My mom was like a ticking time bomb. I never knew when she was going to go off." This pattern of abuse, alternating between sadism and sudden tenderness, is typical of manipulative psychopaths. Michelle could bring her loved ones to complete despair, then suddenly rush to kiss music and hug them, saying, "You know, Mama loves you." This threw everyone off balance and broke their will even further. For the slightest offense, real or imagined, the children music, and Shane faced punishment. One of the signature torture methods was the so-called wallowing ritual, which I described earlier. Essentially, strip the victim naked, drive them out into the freezing cold, and douse them with cold water. And, among the other methods, beatings, the dog cage, screaming. The girls were afraid to tell anyone because their mother threatened to send them to reform school or kill them if they complained. And you know what the most terrifying part is? They still loved their mother. They loved and feared her at the same time. As Nikki would later say, "I loved my mom because I didn't know I had a choice. I had to love her." This is a common phenomenon. Victims of abuse often develop Stockholm syndrome, especially when the abuser is their own mother. I didn't say she was an 80-level manipulator for nothing. Michelle pretended to have cancer, seriously. She shaved her head and eyebrows, wore wigs, told everyone she was undergoing treatment, and thus generated sympathy. And for her own children, the cancer story was another weapon. Like, "Mom could die at any moment, so do everything I say." This fake diagnosis was yet another instrument of control. In essence, Shelley had established her own miniature dictatorship, where everyone around her was a submissive slave. Whenever a new victim appeared, she directed her rage at them, giving the rest a temporary respite. That's what happened with Kathy. While the focus was on her, the children were abused less actively. But when Kathy died, she had to find the next toy to torture. And unfortunately, such people did appear in Michelle's life. Kathy Loreno died in 1994, but only the residents of this house knew it: Michelle, David, and the children. In February 1995, Shane, now 19, told his cousin Nikki about the photographs he had once taken. Those photos where the abused Kathy lay on the floor, or something like that. He shared his intention to hand the roll of film to the police. Shane trusted Nikki. They had grown up together like brother and sister. But Nikki was so terrified that she told her mother about his plan. Michelle sensed a threat. The only way out: get rid of the nephew. Shelley told her husband David that Shane was a traitor who wanted to get them all arrested and ordered him to get rid of the boy. And what do you think? David obediently complied. Music. One day, Shane simply vanished. For neighbors and acquaintances, a story was invented. He had gone to Alaska to work on a fishing boat. In reality, David Nottek drove Shane into the woods and shot him with a rifle. You and Shane had a conflict, right? Yes. Can you describe that conflict or altercation you had with Shane? It was over a rifle. He had the rifle and didn't want to hand it over. What rifle was it? A .22. A rifle. A carbine. A short carbine. And when we were struggling, the rifle went off, hit him in the throat, and Shane fell. He cremated the nephew's body in the yard as well and scattered the ashes so that nothing would remain. The roll of film with Kathy's photographs was located and destroyed. No photos, no evidence. Only Michelle didn't know there was another roll, one that Shane had managed to hide. On it was this frame. In open sources, this photo exists only in this form. Behind a black square, the abused Kathy, unclothed, lies on the floor. Neither Kathy Loreno nor Shane Watson were officially considered dead as of 1995. No one was even looking for them. To those around them, they had simply disappeared. Only Kathy had the official status of missing person. But even that didn't lead to an active search. Michelle's daughters had grown up by then. Nikki was 21, Sammy was 17, and Tori was just 6. They hadn't witnessed the murders but had their suspicions. Despite this, they weren't ready to go against their mother. Sammy would later admit that she had long believed Kathy's death was an accident, that Mom hadn't meant to kill her, just went too far. As for Shane, they suspected, but wanted to believe he was really somewhere in Alaska. After the boy's death, a relative calm settled over the Nottek house. Several years passed. The older daughters grew up and began moving away from that wretched house. Only the youngest sister, Tori, remained, and Michelle found herself a new victim. Ronald Woodard, also known as Ron, a 57-year-old Vietnam War veteran, was an acquaintance of Michelle's. He had his own difficulties, mental health problems, and drug addiction. And that's exactly what the psychopath played on. The woman offered him help and rehabilitation, offered him a room in her house, all for free. Ron agreed because he didn't really have a choice. So, in '99, he found himself in that house, not yet suspecting what grim adventures he had signed up for. Tori had just turned 10. As soon as Ron moved in, Shelley reverted to her old ways. The pattern was the same as with Kathy. Isolate from loved ones, break the psyche, enslave. She convinced Ron that his family and friends had turned away from him, forbade him from leaving the house. Michelle called him worthless, humiliated him daily, driving the man to complete submission. She beat him, forced pills on him, starved him, all while convincing him this was part of rehabilitation. Such a rehabilitation that she could forbid him from using the toilet, and Ron had to go in a bucket outside in the cold. This went on for years. Tori was growing up and beginning to understand that her mother was a sadist. In August 2003, Ron Woodard died as a result of his injuries. Shelley hid the corpse in the freezer, telling friends he had gotten a job in Tacoma. Her husband, David, buried the body behind the house. That's right, Ron Woodard had vanished. Tori was almost 14 at the time, and she found Ron's sudden disappearance suspicious. Tori secretly contacted her older sisters, Nikki and Sammy. They gathered and discussed everything that had been happening behind these doors. In their view, Ron had met the same fate as Kathy. The sisters understood that the time had come to act. The girls decided first to gather some evidence, then go to the police. Tori's task was to take Ron's belongings from the house: clothes, shoes, documents, anything she could find. This was meant to prove that he wouldn't have gone anywhere without his documents. Tori succeeded. She quietly collected everything that could confirm that Ron hadn't gone anywhere. A report was made to the police by the three sisters who claimed their biological mother was a dangerous criminal. The girls provided physical evidence, personal belongings, and documents of the missing Ron Woodward. On August 8, 2003, police arrived at Michelle and David's property with search warrants. In the yard, officers found freshly disturbed soil. Beneath it was Ron Woodward's body, hastily buried. David had to admit that he was the one who had buried Ron on his wife's orders, because she told him that Ron had allegedly taken his own life. Of course, this version was not confirmed. The forensic medical examination established that Ron had died from multiple injuries. It was murder. Michelle and David Notek were immediately arrested that music same day. They were separated from Tori, their youngest daughter. The girl was placed in the care of her older sister, Sammy. During questioning, David suddenly began cooperating with the investigation. Music. He realized the time had come to tell the truth, and a few months after his arrest, he gave a detailed account of all the crimes. He confessed to shooting Shane Watson and to helping his wife cover up Kathy Larino's death. It's important to understand that without this confession, it would have been difficult to charge Michelle with the first two murders, since neither Kathy's body nor Shane's remains had been found by police. But David told everything: how he burned Kathy's and Shane's bodies in the barrel and scattered their ashes on the beach. Thanks to this confession, during searches of the yard, traces of fires were found. Some bone fragments were also found. Among other things, police found that very roll of film that Shane had hidden. The negative music with this photograph became one of the key pieces of evidence. The Nottek daughters gave their testimonies. They confirmed the stories of abuse they had experienced themselves and told everything they knew about the fate of Kathy, Shane, and Ron. Michelle Nottek, prosecutors brought charges of 2 counts of first-degree intentional murder for Kathy Larino and Ron Woodward. David Nottek faced charges of first-degree murder of Shane Watson, as well as concealment of crimes and unlawful handling of corpses. The case was heard behind closed doors, as the Nottek couple had entered into a plea agreement. David pleaded guilty to Shane's murder and to all other charges against him. Michelle chose a different tactic. She formally did not confess to murder, but entered what is known as an Alford plea, where the defendant claims innocence but acknowledges that the prosecution has sufficient evidence for a guilty verdict. Thus, in June 2004, Michelle effectively agreed to accept punishment without admitting guilt. Initially, the parties agreed that Michelle would receive just 17 years in prison. But the judge, having reviewed all the details of the case, increased the sentence to 22 years, the maximum under the plea agreement. She even tried to file an appeal, but it was rejected. David Nottek, thanks to the agreement, received just 15 years in prison for Shane Watson's murder. And yes, some of you have done the math correctly. Both David and Michelle Nottek are free today. David was released on parole in 2016. Michelle Nottek was released early on November 8, 2022. She was 68 at the time. For all those atrocities, she served only 18 years behind bars. Yes, that's the reality. When her daughters learned that their mother was being released early, they raised the alarm. The sisters appealed to the press to warn the world, quoting them, "Our mother is a ticking bomb. She is still dangerous. She is the greatest manipulator I have ever encountered. I don't think she will ever be able to change. If she ever shows up at my door, I will probably lock all the doors and barricade myself in the bathroom to call 911. Where is Michelle Nottek now? At the time of recording this video, she is still alive. After leaving prison, she disappeared from the public eye. She most likely settled somewhere in Washington state and tries to keep a low profile because the attention around her was enormous. It is known that none of her daughters maintained contact with her.